They had been talking of America, of their native country, which they had so little hope of ever seeing again. "Decidedly we have only one way," said Spilett, "one single way for leaving Lincoln Island, and that is, to build a vessel large enough to sail several hundred miles. It appears to me that when one has built a boat, it is just as easy to build a ship." "And in which we might go to the Paumatus," added Herbert, "just as easily as we went to Tabor Island." "I do not say no," replied Pencroft, who had always the casting vote in maritime questions. "I do not say no, although it is not exactly the same thing to make a long as a short voyage. If our little craft had been caught in any heavy gale of wind during the voyage to Tabor Island, we should have known that land was at no great distance either way. But 1,200 miles is a pretty long way, and the nearest land is at least that distance." "Would you not, in that case, Pencroft, attempt the adventure?" asked the reporter. "I will attempt anything that is desired, Mr. Spilett," answered the sailor, "and you know well that I am not a man to flinch. Remember, besides, that we number another sailor amongst us now," remarked Neb. "Who is that?" asked Pencroft. "Ayrton." "That is true," replied Herbert. "If he will consent to come," said Pencroft. "Nonsense," returned the reporter. "Do you think that if Lord Glenarvan's yacht had appeared at Tabor Island whilst he was still living there, Ayrton would have refused to depart?" "You forget, my friends," then said Cyrus Harding, "that Ayrton was not in possession of his reason during the last years of his stay there. But that is not the question. The point is to know if we may count among our chances of being rescued the return of the Scotch vessel. Now, Lord Glenarvan promised Ayrton that he would return to take him off Tabor Island when he considered that his crimes were expiated, and I believe that he will return." "Yes," said the reporter, "and I will add that he will return soon, for it is 12 years since Ayrton was abandoned." "Well," answered Pencroft, "I agree with you that the nobleman will return, and soon too, but where will he touch? At Tabor Island, and not at Lincoln Island." "That is the more certain," replied Herbert, "as Lincoln Island is not even marked on the map." "Therefore, my friends," said the engineer, "we ought to take the necessary precautions for making our presence, and that of Ayrton on Lincoln Island known at Tabor Island." "Certainly," answered the reporter, "and nothing is easier than to place in the hut, which was Captain Grant's and Ayrton's dwelling, a notice which Lord Glenarvan and his crew cannot help finding, giving the position of our island." "It is a pity," remarked the sailor, "that we forgot to take that precaution on our first visit to Tabor Island." "And why should we have done it?" asked Herbert. "At that time, we did not know Ayrton's history. We did not know that anyone was likely to come some day to fetch him, and when we did know his history, the season was too advanced to allow us to return then to Tabor Island." "Yes," replied Harding, "it was too late, and we must put off the voyage until next spring." "But suppose the Scotch yacht comes before that," said Pencroft. "That is not probable," replied the engineer, "for Lord Glenarvan would not choose the winter season to venture into these seas. Either he has already returned to Tabor Island, since Ayrton has been with us, that is to say, during the last 5 months, and has left again, or he will not come till later, and it will be time enough in the first fine October days to go to Tabor Island and leave a notice there." "We must allow," said Neb, "that it will be very unfortunate if the Duncan has returned to these parts only a few months ago." "I hope that it is not so," replied Cyrus Harding, "and that heaven has not deprived us of the best chance which remains to us." "I think," observed the reporter, "that at any rate we shall know what we have to depend on when we have been to Tabor Island, for if the yacht has returned there, they will necessarily have left some traces of their visit." "That is evident," answered the engineer. "So then, my friends, since we have this chance of returning to our country, we must wait patiently, and if it is taken from us, we shall see what will be best to do." "At any rate," remarked Pencroft, "it is well understood that if we do leave Lincoln Island in some way or another, it will not be because we were uncomfortable there." "No, Pencroft," replied the engineer, It will be because we are far from all that a man holds dearest in this world, his family, his friends, his native land. Matters being thus decided, the building of a vessel large enough to sail either to the archipelagos in the north or to New Zealand in the west was no longer talked of, and they busied themselves in their accustomed occupations with a view to wintering a third time in Granite House. However, it was agreed that before the stormy weather came on, their little vessel should be employed in making a voyage round the island. A complete survey of the coast had not yet been made, and the colonists had but an imperfect idea of the shore to the west and north, from the mouth of Falls River to the Mandible Capes, as well as of the narrow bay between them, which opened like a shark's jaws. The plan of this excursion was proposed by Pencroft, and Cyrus Harding fully acquiesced in it, for he himself wished to see this part of his domain. The weather was variable, but the barometer did not fluctuate by sudden movements, and they could therefore count on tolerable weather. However, during the first week of April, after a sudden barometrical fall, a renewed rise was marked by a heavy gale of wind, lasting 5 or 6 days. Then the needle of the instrument remained stationary at a height of 29 inches and 9/10, and the weather appeared propitious for an excursion. The departure was fixed for the 16th of April, and the Bonadventure, anchored in Port Balloon, was provisioned for a voyage which might be of some duration. Cyrus Harding informed Ayrton of the projected expedition and proposed that he should take part in it, but Ayrton preferring to remain on shore, it was decided that he should come to Granite House during the absence of his companions. Master Jup was ordered to keep him company and made no remonstrance. On the morning of the 16th of April, all the colonists, including Top, embarked. A fine breeze blew from the southwest, and the Bonadventure tacked on leaving Port Balloon so as to reach Reptile End. Of the 90 miles which the perimeter of the island measured, 20 included the south coast between the port and the promontory. The wind being right ahead, it was necessary to hug the shore. It took the whole day to reach the promontory, for the vessel on leaving port had only 2 hours of the ebb tide, and had therefore to make way for 6 hours against the flood. It was nightfall before the promontory was doubled. The sailor then proposed to the engineer that they should continue sailing slowly with 2 reefs in the sail, but Harding preferred to anchor a few cable lengths from the shore so as to survey that part of the coast during the day. It was agreed also that as they were anxious for a minute exploration of the coast, they should not sail during the night, but would always, when the weather permitted it, be at anchor near the shore. The night was passed under the promontory, and the wind having fallen, nothing disturbed the silence. The passengers, with the exception of the sailor, scarcely slept as well on board the Bonadventure as they would have done in their rooms at Granite House, but they did sleep however. Pencroft set sail at break of day, and by going on the larboard tack, they could keep close to the shore. The colonists knew this beautiful wooded coast, since they had already explored it on foot, and yet it again excited their admiration. They coasted along as close in as possible, so as to notice everything, avoiding always the trunks of trees which floated here and there. Several times also they anchored, and Gideon Spilett took photographs of the superb scenery. About noon, the Bonadventure arrived at the mouth of Falls River. Beyond, on the left bank, a few scattered trees appeared, and 3 miles further even these dwindled into solitary groups among the western spurs of the mountain, whose arid ridge sloped down to the shore. What a contrast between the northern and southern part of the coast! In proportion as one was woody and fertile, so was the other rugged and barren. It might have been designated as one of those iron coasts, as they are called in some countries, and its wild confusion appeared to indicate that a sudden crystallization had been produced in the yet liquid basalt of some distant geological sea. These stupendous masses would have terrified the settlers if they had been cast at first on this part of the island. They had not been able to perceive the sinister aspect of this shore from the summit of Mount Franklin, for they overlooked it from too great a height, but viewed from the sea, it presented a wild appearance, which could not perhaps be equaled in any corner of the globe. The Bonadventure sailed along this coast for the distance of half a mile. It was easy to see that it was composed of blocks of all sizes, from 20 to 300 feet in height, and of all shapes, round like towers, prismatic like steeples, pyramidal like obelisks, conical like factory chimneys. An iceberg of the polar seas could not have been more capricious in its terrible sublimity. Here bridges were thrown from one rock to another, there arches like those of a wave, into the depths of which the eye could not penetrate. In one place, large vaulted excavations presented a monumental aspect. In another, a crowd of columns, spires, and arches, such as no Gothic cathedral ever possessed. Every caprice of nature, still more varied than those of the imagination, appeared on this grand coast, which extended over a length of 8 or 9 miles. Cyrus Harding and his companions gazed, with a feeling of surprise bordering on stupefaction. But although they remained silent, Top, not being troubled with feelings of this sort, uttered barks, which were repeated by the 1,000 echoes of the basaltic cliff. The engineer even observed that these barks had something strange in them, like those which the dog had uttered at the mouth of the well in Granite House. "Let us go close in," said he. And the Bonadventure sailed as near as possible to the rocky shore. Perhaps some cave, which it would be advisable to explore, existed there, but Harding saw nothing, not a cavern, not a cleft, which could serve as a retreat to any being whatever, for the foot of the cliff was washed by the surf. Soon Top's bark ceased, and the vessel continued her course at a few cable lengths from the coast. In the northwest part of the island, the shore became again flat and sandy. A few trees here and there rose above a low, marshy ground, which the colonists had already surveyed, and in violent contrast to the other desert shore, life was again manifested by the presence of myriads of waterfowl. That evening, the Bonadventure anchored in a small bay to the north of the island, near the land. Such was the depth of water there. The night passed quietly, for the breeze died away with the last light of day, and only rose again with the first streaks of dawn. As it was easy to land, the usual hunters of the colony, that is to say, Herbert and Gideon Spilett, went for a ramble of 2 hours or so, and returned with several strings of wild duck and snipe. Top had done wonders, and not a bird had been lost, thanks to his zeal and cleverness. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the Bonadventure set sail, and ran rapidly towards North Mandible Cape, for the wind was right astern and freshening rapidly. "However," observed Pencroft, "I should not be surprised if a gale came up from the west. Yesterday the sun set in a very red-looking horizon, and now, this morning, those mare's-tails don't forebode anything good." These mare's-tails are cirrus clouds, scattered in the zenith, their height from the sea being less than 5,000 feet. They look like light pieces of cotton wool, and their presence usually announces some sudden change in the weather. "Well," said Harding, "let us carry as much sail as possible and run for shelter into Shark Gulf. I think that the Bonadventure will be safe there." "Perfectly," replied Pencroft, "and besides, the north coast is merely sand, very uninteresting to look at." "I shall not be sorry," resumed the engineer, "to pass not only tonight but tomorrow in that bay, which is worth being carefully explored." "I think that we shall be obliged to do so, whether we like it or not," answered Pencroft, "for the sky looks very threatening towards the west. Dirty weather is coming on." "At any rate, we have a favorable wind for reaching Cape Mandible," observed the reporter. "A very fine wind," replied the sailor, "but we must tack to enter the Gulf, and I should like to see my way clear in these unknown quarters." "Quarters which appear to be filled with rocks," added Herbert, "if we judge by what we saw on the south coast of Shark Gulf." "Pencroft," said Cyrus Harding, "do as you think best, we will leave it to you." "Don't make your mind uneasy, Captain," replied the sailor. "I shall not expose myself needlessly. I would rather a knife were run into my ribs than a sharp rock into those of my Bonadventure." That which Pencroft called ribs was the part of his vessel under water, and he valued it more than his own skin. "What o'clock is it?" asked Pencroft. 10 o'clock, replied Gideon Spilett. "And what distance is it to the Cape, Captain?" "About 15 miles, replied the engineer. "That's a matter of 2 hours and a half," said the sailor, and we shall be off the Cape between 12 and 1 o'clock. Unluckily, the tide will be turning at that moment and will be ebbing out of the Gulf. I am afraid that it will be very difficult to get in, having both wind and tide against us." "And the more so that it is a full moon today," remarked Herbert, "and these April tides are very strong." "Well, Pencroft," asked Cyrus Harding, "can you not anchor off the Cape?" "Anchor near land, with bad weather coming on," exclaimed the sailor. "What are you thinking of, Captain? We should run aground to a certainty." "What will you do then?" "I shall try to keep in the offing until the flood, that is to say, till about 7 in the evening, and if there is still light enough, I will try to enter the Gulf. If not, we must stand off and on during the night, and we will enter tomorrow at sunrise." "As I told you, Pencroft, we will leave it to you," answered Harding. "Ah," said Pencroft, "if there was only a lighthouse on the coast, it would be much more convenient for sailors." "Yes," replied Herbert, "and this time we shall have no obliging engineer to light a fire to guide us into port." "Why indeed, my dear Cyrus," said Spilett, "we have never thanked you for it, but frankly, without that fire we should never have been able to reach." "A fire?" asked Harding, much astonished at the reporter's words. "We mean, Captain," answered Pencroft, "that on board the Bonadventure we were very anxious during the few hours before our return, and we should have passed to windward of the island if it had not been for the precaution you took of lighting a fire in the night of the 19th of October on Prospect Heights." "Yes, yes, that was a lucky idea of mine," replied the engineer. "And this time," continued the sailor, "unless the idea occurs to Ayrton, there will be no one to do us that little service." "No, no one," answered Cyrus Harding. A few minutes after, finding himself alone in the bows of the vessel with the reporter, the engineer bent down and whispered, "If there is one thing certain in this world, Spilett, it is that I never lighted any fire during the night of the 19th of October, neither on Prospect Heights nor on any other part of the island." Another mystery, another mystery. Chapter 20. A night at sea, Shark Gulf, confidences, preparations for winter, forwardness of the bad season, severe cold, work in the interior, in 6 months, a photographic negative, unexpected incident. Things happened as Pencroft had predicted, he being seldom mistaken in his prognostications. The wind rose, and from a fresh breeze it soon increased to a regular gale. That is to say, it acquired a speed of from 40 to 45 miles an hour, before which a ship in the open sea would have run under close-reefed topsails. Now, as it was nearly 6 o'clock when the Bonadventure reached the Gulf, and as at that moment the tide turned, it was impossible to enter. They were therefore compelled to stand off, for even if he had wished to do so, Pencroft could not have gained the mouth of the Mersey. Hoisting the jib to the mainmast by way of a storm sail, he hove to, putting the head of the vessel towards the land. Fortunately, although the wind was strong, the sea, being sheltered by the land, did not run very high. They had then little to fear from the waves, which always endanger small craft. The Bonadventure would doubtlessly not have capsized, for she was well ballasted, but enormous masses of water falling on the deck might injure her if her timbers could not sustain them. Pencroft, as a good sailor, was prepared for anything. Certainly, he had great confidence in his vessel, but nevertheless, he awaited the return of day with some anxiety. During the night, Cyrus Harding and Gideon Spilett had no opportunity for talking together, and yet the words pronounced in the reporter's ear by the engineer were well worth being discussed, together with the mysterious influence which appeared to reign over Lincoln Island. Gideon Spilett did not cease from pondering over this new and inexplicable incident, the appearance of a fire on the coast of the island. The fire had actually been seen. His companions, Herbert and Pencroft, had seen it with him. Fire had served to signalize the position of the island during that dark night, and they had not doubted that it was lighted by the engineer's hand. And here was Cyrus Harding expressly declaring that he had never done anything of the sort. Spilett resolved to recur to this incident as soon as the Bonadventure returned, and to urge Cyrus Harding to acquaint their companions with these strange facts. Perhaps, it would be decided to make in common a complete investigation of every part of Lincoln Island. However that might be, on this evening no fire was lighted on these yet unknown shores, which formed the entrance to the Gulf, and the little vessel stood off during the night. When the first streaks of dawn appeared in the western horizon, the wind, which had slightly fallen, shifted 2 points and enabled Pencroft to enter the narrow gulf with greater ease. Towards 7 o'clock in the morning, the Bonadventure, weathering the North Mandible Cape, entered the strait and glided on to the waters, so strangely enclosed in the frame of lava. "Well," said Pencroft, "this bay would make admirable roads, in which a whole fleet could lie at their ease." "What is especially curious," observed Harding, "is that the gulf has been formed by 2 rivers of lava thrown out by the volcano and accumulated by successive eruptions. The result is that the gulf is completely sheltered on all sides, and I believe that even in the stormiest weather, the sea here must be as calm as a lake." "No doubt," returned the sailor, "since the wind has only that narrow entrance between the 2 capes to get in by, and besides, the North Cape protects that of the south in a way which would make the entrance of gusts very difficult. I declare our Bonadventure could stay here from one end of the year to the other without even dragging at her anchor." "It is rather large for her," observed the reporter. "Well, Mr. Spilett," replied the sailor, "I agree that it is too large for the Bonadventure, but if the fleets of the Union were in want of a harbor in the Pacific, I don't think they would ever find a better place than this." "We are in the Shark's Mouth," remarked Neb, alluding to the form of the gulf. "Right into its mouth, my honest Neb," replied Herbert, "but you are not afraid that it will shut upon us, are you?" "No, Mr. Herbert," answered Neb, "and yet this gulf here doesn't please me much. It has a wicked look." "Hallo!" cried Pencroft, "here is Neb turning up his nose at my gulf, just as I was thinking of presenting it to America." "But at any rate, is the water deep enough?" asked the engineer, for a depth sufficient for the keel of the Bonadventure would not be enough for those of our ironclads. "That is easily found out," replied Pencroft. And the sailor sounded with a long cord, which served him as a lead line, and to which was fastened a lump of iron. This cord measured nearly 50 fathoms, and its entire length was unrolled without finding any bottom. "There," exclaimed Pencroft, "our ironclads can come here after all. They would not run aground." "Indeed," said Gideon Spilett, "this gulf is a regular abyss, but taking into consideration the volcanic origin of the island, it is not astonishing that the sea should offer similar depressions." "One would say, too," observed Herbert, "that these cliffs were perfectly perpendicular, and I believe that at their foot, even with a line 5 or 6 times longer, Pencroft would not find the bottom." "That is all very well," then said the reporter, "but I must point out to Pencroft that his harbor is wanting in one very important respect." "And what is that, Mr. Spilett?" "An opening, a cutting of some sort, to give access to the interior of the island. I do not see a spot on which we could land." And in fact, the steep lava cliffs did not afford a single place suitable for landing. They formed an insuperable barrier, recalling, but with more wildness, the fjords of Norway. The Bonadventure, coasting as close as possible along the cliffs, did not discover even a projection which would allow the passengers to leave the deck. Pencroft consoled himself by saying that with the help of a mine they could soon open out the cliff when that was necessary, and then, as there was evidently nothing to be done in the gulf, he steered his vessel towards the strait and passed out at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. "Ah," said Neb, uttering a sigh of satisfaction. One might really say that the honest Negro did not feel at his ease in those enormous jaws. The distance from Mandible Cape to the mouth of the Mersey was not more than 8 miles. The head of the Bonadventure was put towards Granite House, and a fair wind filling her sails, she ran rapidly along the coast. To the enormous lava rocks succeeded soon those capricious sand dunes, among which the engineer had been so singularly recovered, and which sea-birds frequented in thousands. About 4 o'clock, Pencroft, leaving the point of the islet on his left, entered the channel which separated it from the coast, and at 5 o'clock the anchor of the Bonadventure was buried in the sand at the mouth of the Mersey. The colonists had been absent 3 days from their dwelling. Ayrton was waiting for them on the beach, and Jup came joyously to meet them, giving vent to deep grunts of satisfaction. A complete exploration of the coast of the island had now been made, and no suspicious appearances had been observed. If any mysterious being resided on it, it could only be under cover of the impenetrable forest of the Serpentine Peninsula, to which the colonists had not yet directed their investigations. Gideon Spilett discussed these things with the engineer, and it was agreed that they should direct the attention of their companions to the strange character of certain incidents which had occurred on the island, and of which the last was the most unaccountable. However, Harding, returning to the fact of a fire having been kindled on the shore by an unknown hand, could not refrain from repeating for the 20th time to the reporter, "But are you quite sure of having seen it? Was it not a partial eruption of the volcano, or perhaps some meteor?" "No, Cyrus," answered the reporter. "It was certainly a fire lighted by the hand of man. Besides, question Pencroft and Herbert. They saw it as I saw it myself, and they will confirm my words." In consequence, therefore, a few days after, on the 25th of April, in the evening, when the settlers were all collected on Prospect Heights, Cyrus Harding began by saying, "My friends, I think it my duty to call your attention to certain incidents which have occurred in the island, on the subject of which I shall be happy to have your advice. These incidents are, so to speak, supernatural." "Supernatural!" exclaimed the sailor, emitting a volume of smoke from his mouth. "Can it be possible that our island is supernatural?" "No, Pencroft, but mysterious, most certainly," replied the engineer, "unless you can explain that which Spilett and I have until now failed to understand." "Speak away, Captain," answered the sailor. "Well, have you understood?" then said the engineer. "How was it that after falling into the sea, I was found a quarter of a mile into the interior of the island, and that, without my having any consciousness of my removal there?" "Unless, being unconscious," said Pencroft. "That is not admissible," replied the engineer. "But to continue, have you understood how Top was able to discover your retreat 5 miles from the cave in which I was lying?" "The dog's instinct," observed Herbert. "Singular instinct," returned the reporter, "since notwithstanding the storm of rain and wind which was raging during that night, Top arrived at the Chimneys dry and without a speck of mud." "Let us continue," resumed the engineer. "Have you understood how our dog was so strangely thrown up out of the waters of the lake after his struggle with the dugong?" "No, I confess, not at all," replied Pencroft. "And the wound which the dugong had in its side, a wound which seemed to have been made with a sharp instrument, that can't be understood either." "Let us continue again," said Harding. "Have you understood, my friends, how that bullet got into the body of the young peccary, how that case happened to be so fortunately stranded, without there being any trace of a wreck, how that bottle containing the document presented itself so opportunely during our first sea excursion, how our canoe, having broken its moorings, floated down the current of the Mersey and rejoined us precisely at the very moment we needed it, how after the ape invasion the ladder was so obligingly thrown down from Granite House, and lastly, how the document, which Ayrton asserts was never written by him, fell into our hands." As Cyrus Harding thus enumerated, without forgetting one, the singular incidents which had occurred in the island, Herbert, Neb, and Pencroft stared at each other, not knowing what to reply, for this succession of incidents, grouped thus for the first time, could not but excite their surprise to the highest degree. "'Pon my word," said Pencroft at last, "you are right, Captain, and it is difficult to explain all these things." "Well, my friends," resumed the engineer, "a last fact has just been added to these, and it is no less incomprehensible than the others." "What is it, Captain?" asked Herbert quickly. "When you were returning from Tabor Island, Pencroft," continued the engineer, you said that a fire appeared on Lincoln Island. Certainly, answered the sailor. And you are quite certain of having seen this fire? As sure as I see you now. You also, Herbert. Why, Captain, cried Herbert, that fire was blazing like a star of the first magnitude. But was it not a star? Urged the engineer. No, replied Pencroft, for the sky was covered with thick clouds, and at any rate a star would not have been so low on the horizon. But Mr. Spilett saw it as well as we, and he will confirm our words. I will add, said the reporter, that the fire was very bright, and that it shot up like a sheet of lightning. Yes, yes, exactly, added Herbert, and it was certainly placed on the heights of Granite House. Well, my friends, replied Cyrus Harding, during the night of the 19th of October, neither Neb nor I lighted any fire on the coast. You did not, exclaimed Pencroft, in the height of his astonishment, not being able to finish his sentence. We did not leave Granite House, answered Cyrus Harding, and if a fire appeared on the coast, it was lighted by another hand than ours. Pencroft, Herbert, and Neb were stupefied. No illusion could be possible, and a fire had actually met their eyes during the night of the 19th of October. Yes, they were obliged to acknowledge it, a mystery existed, an inexplicable influence, evidently favorable to the colonists, but very irritating to their curiosity, was executed always in the nick of time on Lincoln Island. Could there be some being hidden in its profoundest recesses? It was necessary at any cost to ascertain this. Harding also reminded his companions of the singular behavior of Top and Jup when they prowled round the mouth of the well, which placed Granite House in communication with the sea, and he told them that he had explored the well without discovering anything suspicious. The final resolve taken, in consequence of this conversation, by all the members of the colony was that as soon as the fine season returned, they would thoroughly search the whole of the island. But from that day, Pencroft appeared to be anxious. He felt as if the island which he had made his own personal property belonged to him entirely no longer, and that he shared it with another master, to whom, whether willing or not, he felt subject. Neb and he often talked of those unaccountable things, and both, their natures inclining them to the marvelous, were not far from believing that Lincoln Island was under the dominion of some supernatural power. In the meanwhile, the bad weather came with the month of May, the November of the northern zones. It appeared that the winter would be severe and forward. The preparations for the winter season were therefore commenced without delay. Returning from a sporting excursion. Nevertheless, the colonists were well prepared to meet the winter, however hard it might be. They had plenty of felt clothing, and the Musmons, very numerous by this time, had furnished an abundance of the wool necessary for the manufacture of this warm material. It is unnecessary to say that Ayrton had been provided with this comfortable clothing. Cyrus Harding proposed that he should come to spend the bad season with them in Granite House, where he would be better lodged than at the corral, and Ayrton promised to do so as soon as the last work at the corral was finished. He did this towards the middle of April. From that time, Ayrton shared the common life and made himself useful on all occasions, but still humble and sad, he never took part in the pleasures of his companions. For the greater part of this, the third winter which the settlers passed in Lincoln Island, they were confined to Granite House. There were many violent storms and frightful tempests, which appeared to shake the rocks to their very foundations. Immense waves threatened to overwhelm the island, and certainly any vessel anchored near the shore would have been dashed to pieces. Twice, during one of these hurricanes, the Mersey swelled to such a degree as to give reason to fear that the bridges would be swept away, and it was necessary to strengthen those on the shore, which disappeared under the foaming waters when the sea beat against the beach. It may well be supposed that such storms, comparable to waterspouts in which were mingled rain and snow, would cause great havoc on the plateau of Prospect Heights. The mill and the poultry yard particularly suffered. The colonists were often obliged to make immediate repairs, without which the safety of the birds would have been seriously threatened. The photographic negative. During the worst weather, several jaguars and troops of quadrumana ventured to the edge of the plateau, and it was always to be feared that the most active and audacious would, urged by hunger, manage to cross the stream, which besides, when frozen, offered them an easy passage. Plantations and domestic animals would then have been infallibly destroyed without a constant watch, and it was often necessary to make use of the guns to keep those dangerous visitors at a respectful distance. Occupation was not wanting to the colonists, for without reckoning their outdoor cares, they had always 1,000 plans for the fitting up of Granite House. They had also some fine sporting excursions, which were made during the frost in the vast Tadorn Marsh. Gideon Spilett and Herbert, aided by Jup and Top, did not miss a shot in the midst of the myriads of wild duck, snipe, teal, and others. The access to these hunting grounds was easy. Besides, whether they reached them by the road to Port Balloon, after having passed the Mersey Bridge, or by turning the rocks from Flotsam Point, the hunters were never distant from Granite House more than 2 or 3 miles. Thus passed the 4 winter months, which were really rigorous, that is to say, June, July, August, and September. But in short, Granite House did not suffer much from the inclemency of the weather, and it was the same with the corral, which, less exposed than the plateau and sheltered partly by Mount Franklin, only received the remains of the hurricanes, already broken by the forests and the high rocks of the shore. The damages there were consequently of small importance, and the activity and skill of Ayrton promptly repaired them, when sometime in October he returned to pass a few days in the corral. During this winter, no fresh inexplicable incident occurred. Nothing strange happened, although Pencroft and Neb were on the watch for the most insignificant facts to which they attached any mysterious cause. Top and Jup themselves no longer growled round the well or gave any signs of uneasiness. It appeared, therefore, as if the series of supernatural incidents was interrupted, although they often talked of them during the evenings in Granite House, and they remained thoroughly resolved that the island should be searched, even in those parts the most difficult to explore. But an event of the highest importance, and of which the consequence might be terrible, momentarily diverted from their projects Cyrus Harding and his companions. It was the month of October. The fine season was swiftly returning. Nature was reviving, and among the evergreen foliage of the coniferae which formed the border of the wood already appeared the young leaves of the banksias, deodars, and other trees. It may be remembered that Gideon Spilett and Herbert had, at different times, taken photographic views of Lincoln Island. Now, on the 17th of this month of October, towards 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Herbert, enticed by the charms of the sky, thought of reproducing Union Bay, which was opposite to Prospect Heights, from Cape Mandible to Claw Cape. The horizon was beautifully clear, and the sea, undulating under a soft breeze, was as calm as the waters of a lake, sparkling here and there under the sun's rays. The apparatus had been placed at one of the windows of the dining room at Granite House, and consequently overlooked the shore and the bay. Herbert proceeded as he was accustomed to do, and the negative obtained, he went away to fix it by means of the chemicals deposited in a dark nook of Granite House. Returning to the bright light and examining it well, Herbert perceived on his negative an almost imperceptible little spot on the sea horizon. He endeavored to make it disappear by reiterated washing, but could not accomplish it. "It is a flaw in the glass," he thought. And then he had the curiosity to examine this flaw with a strong magnifier, which he unscrewed from one of the telescopes. But he had scarcely looked at it when he uttered a cry, and the glass almost fell from his hands. Immediately running to the room in which Cyrus Harding then was, he extended the negative and magnifier towards the engineer, pointing out the little spot. Harding examined it, then seizing his telescope, he rushed to the window. The telescope, after having slowly swept the horizon, at last stopped on the looked-for spot, and Cyrus Harding, lowering it, pronounced one word only: "A vessel." And in fact, a vessel was in sight off Lincoln Island. The Temple Press, Printers, Letchworth.